Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Hope you got that. All right, as for this episode, our featured guest is Izabella Tabarovsky. Now, she's a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center and a contributing writer at Tablet magazine. Her expertise includes many, including Soviet Jewry, Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary left anti-Semitism, the Holocaust in the USSR, Stalin's repressions, and the politics of historical memory. Now, in addition to Tablet, her writings have appeared in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Forward, The Wilson Quarterly, Times of Israel, Fathom, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and many others. And with that, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to welcome Izabella to IsraelCast, who joins us now on the line via Zoom from Jerusalem. Izabella, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Oh, listen, I've been wanting to speak to you for the longest time, so really very glad to have you aboard. Lots of bases to cover with you, as we always have with all of our guests. And I'd really love our listeners, Izabella, to hear more about your background as we begin our conversation. So really do share your story. And if in the progress, you can also weigh in really how typical your experiences were growing up Jewish in the Soviet Union.
Sure, happy to. So I grew up in a town, a city, a big city actually called Novosibirsk, but in a scientific suburb, which was called Academy Town, Akadem Gorodok. I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s. I would say that for a Russian, fairly assimilated Jewish family, we were pretty typical. Very different, I would say, though, for example, from the Ukrainian Jewish experience. But for us, look, we were in a place where there hadn't been any Jewish tradition. There were no synagogues. There were no, nothing really. By the 70s, all of the Jewish culture had been eliminated, and so you wouldn't have even known what to ask for. Like there was no tradition. There was no language. All the languages were prohibited. Nothing, no knowledge of any kind. And yet. We all knew that we were Jewish, and the conversations about our Jewishness were constant and ongoing. And this being a scientific enclave, there were a lot of Jews in science in the Soviet Union, and the conversations were about being Jewish in science all the time. All of our friends were Jewish. And this is a really interesting question about Soviet Jews, because when you eliminate everything, both religion and tradition and observance and literature, everything, all of the ethnic markers, right? There is nothing left. How do you know? Why is your Jewish identity so strong? And the answer is that, in a way, the Soviet state perpetuated this identity, even as it tried to assimilate us, even as it tried to eliminate everything we had. It made sure to record our identity as Jews on our internal identification papers. Everybody's identity was declared. If you were Uzbek, ethnically Uzbek, it would have been written that you're Uzbek. So it's not that somehow Jews were separated out. The difference was that there was nothing really attached to this identity. Again, everything, like growing up, I probably knew more about, Ukrainian dances and Tajik national dress and, Moldovan cuisine than I knew about what it meant to be Jewish. But I knew that I was Jewish. It was a factor in my life. And in that sense, it was a very typical Jewish experience.
So Novosibirsk is in Siberia.
It is.
Where did your family originally come from, and when did they settle in Novosibirsk?
Well, that's a very good question. So on one side of my family, they originally came from Kiev during the war. They were evacuated. A big part of the family lived in Siberia already for hundreds of years, I would say, and we don't really know how they ended up there. My parents came to Novosibirsk from two different, also Siberian cities, but they came there in the 60s because I knew this new town, this new scientific enclave was being built. A new university had been built, new research institutes were being built, and it was kind of a new and exciting thing. Basically a town for young people, as it seemed at that time, more liberal environment, much more liberal. And so they came there, and that's why we were there.
And what was it, though, about Judaism that you knew or that you didn't know? Because certainly you weren't practicing. So what were those conversations around Judaism and being Jewish like then for you, for your friends, for friends of the family?
The conversations were never about Judaism. They were about being Jewish. There were a lot of jokes about being Jewish. Look, we stood out among other people by looking different. The Jewish look. A lot of times when I say to Americans, well, you used to be able to be recognized as Jewish, and people would not understand. They would look at me and they would say, well, how do I look Jewish? What does it mean to look Jewish? And it's hard to explain that in that environment, in that Soviet environment, the only way you would have this kind of the look that, for example, I have, all the jokes about the Jewish nose, all of that was part of our experience and part of our life. We all look different. And so there were conversations about that, there were conversations about Israel, but kind of from, I don't know, it's hard to explain, nothing, because nobody really knew much, except for whatever stereotypes existed. But anti-Semitism was also part of our lives. So, you could be called out in the street for your look, right? So everybody would know that you were a Jew. My family had troubles throughout the whole time, like with defending dissertations or getting into universities. This was also very, very typical. And so you always had conversations about that. And then, there's one other thing, as I think about it. Actually, I just wrote an article about it. It will come out in a few weeks in Sapir, about how Soviet Jews were deprived of what's called this thick Jewish culture, but meaning the culture, the ethnic identification, religious identification, but they developed sort of a thin Jewish culture. And that means that, faced with this experience of being strangers or being different, sort of kind of assimilated, but also different, part of the Russian intelligentsia, but not really, they kind of developed this thin Jewish culture. So who were Jews? Jews were people who had a lot of books at home. They were people who, had subscriptions to symphony matinees, and they took their children to study music and to, go to improve themselves in all these other ways. So somehow that was something that kind of made them stand apart as well. This is how we explained it to ourselves, I suppose, what made us different. Jews were people with a lot of education. So all of the things that they're so intangible when you speak about it from, a 30, 40-year distance when the Soviet Union is no more and, you are in America or in Israel, it seems so strange, and yet it was part of our Jewish identity.
Would it be fair to say, Izabella, that all of those, I'm going to use the term that you used, ethnic markers for Jews were just in total contrast to those of Soviet citizens and Russians? In other words, education, the arts, culture, the study of science, all of the things that Jews today embrace, culture and so on. Yet Russians were not engaged in that. I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate a little bit more on that.
The Russian people also engaged in culture and in cultural production, of course, absolutely. There was ethnic Russian intelligentsia, there was ethnic intelligentsia of other ethnic groups as well. But I think perhaps because we were a minority, it was much more sort of concentrated for us. It's like more of us, proportionately speaking, were engaged in that than, say, in a majority culture. And look, this is highly unscientific. This was based on feeling. This was how it felt. I think this was how we tried to explain our difference, which was there, but which we couldn't really understand. And I think what happens in the 60s to happen is that people begin to directly ask the question, what does it really mean to be a Jew? They're telling me that I am different. They're calling me a kike. They're not letting me get into a university that I want to get into. So what does it actually mean to be a Jew? So this question of Jewish identity is pretty central, I think, to the Soviet Jewish experience as it evolved.
Interesting. Now, Izabella, people don't realize a lot of the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism that we see stems from what the Soviets did in the 1950s, where they created a whole department to foster anti-Zionism initiatives. And I'd love it if you can address that.
Sure. Well, I think the main, really the slogans that we hear today, I would say that they date not so much to the 50s as to perhaps from 67 onward. The slogans that we hear today, such as Zionism is racism, Zionism and imperialism and fascism and Nazism are kind of all, equated. It does begin much, much earlier than that. The Soviets were always anti-Zionist. The Bolsheviks from the beginning wanted to get rid of the Zionist parties. They saw them as competition. They saw them as being against socialist internationalism. So already in the 20s, they begin to really do away in a really brutal way with the Zionists. In the 40s, then you have Stalin and his anti-Semitic campaigns, which are very much include the anti-Zionist component. So there is the Doctor's Plot, the Night of the Murdered Poets, as it's known in America, also happens in those years. But then when you get to 1967, when Israel wins in the Six-Day War, that's when it really explodes. That's when the Soviets really feel threatened. They feel that their foreign institutes are threatened in the Middle East. They cannot believe that the little Israel won this war all by itself. And so they really begin to embrace these theories that clearly if Israelis won, well, there must be Zionists in New York who control the banks who support them. There must be Zionists in New York and Washington who control the press and support them, and Zionists in Washington who control the government. And they're very careful not to say that these are Jews because they know that they cannot say it. They always position themselves as anti-fascist. They, of course, pride themselves on defeating Hitler. And so you will never really hear them say, sometimes, but really on the official level, you would never hear them say, well, it's the Jews who control everything, right? They always talk about Zionists. And this is when they begin to develop the distinction that we also see today, that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, because they want to be able to attack Jews, to attack Israel, but from this kind of Zionist critique perspective. And they put the entire that a massive propaganda instrument in their hands, international propaganda. So this goes both for domestic consumption and international. And they target all of the groups in the West, in the developing world that they want to bring onto their side. And it really, they spread all of these ideas. And
I'd like to pivot, actually, if you don't mind, and talk about the Refuseniks, their story. We had Marina Furman, whom I dearly love, who you know as well.
She's wonderful.
Yes. And we want to say hello, Marina, because she's one of our very avid listeners. And she, of course, shared her story and that of her husband, Lev Furman. Their story really needs to be studied more. And sadly, it's being lost to history. And for those who might have a passing knowledge, can you share who they were? What was their goal? What are really some of the key things we should really know about Refuseniks, what they stood for in the Refusenik movement?
Sure, absolutely. I think that I'll start with something that I would call a misperception. I think that if anybody remembers that movement, they remember it as a movement for immigration, that here were Soviet Jews who were locked up in the Soviet cage, and they wanted to be free. They wanted to live in America or in Israel. This is all correct. And this is actually how I think American Jews who struggled for Soviet Jews framed it. And they did it correctly for political reasons. It worked. It really worked from the political perspective. I think that if you look at it internally, from the internal Soviet Jewish perspective, I would say that it's a somewhat superficial point of view, because I think that what the Refuseniks fought for, and first of all, let me back up. Who were the Refuseniks? The Refuseniks were the activist group, Jewish activists who, in the wake of 1967, became really inspired, first of all, by the victory of Israel, and began to really want to know. I think I referred to it earlier, but there was sort of this dual reason why Soviet Jews might want to know about their identity. One was the negative reason that they experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. And the other was when Israel won, and they all of a sudden, and this is true for my father, I talked to him about it, all of a sudden they find that being Jewish can be a source of pride. And they realize that there is a country somewhere over there where Jews live and Jews fight for themselves and they build their own life, and they know nothing about this country and they suddenly want to know. And so this group of activists begins to kind of dig into it. What is it really? What does it mean to be a Jew? And, I've heard so many incredibly moving stories. One story that it's always stuck in my mind. I'll share it. I hope that the person who told me that, and if he's hearing, won't mind that I share it. I, of course, won't name him. But a part of this also had to do with, I think, a search for meaning. So this person told me that part of his desire to understand himself was just kind of wanting to understand something. It was a search for meaning. And so he wanted to read the Chumash. He wanted to read the Bible. Where can he get the Bible? They're all stored in special sections of the libraries. You have to have special permission to access them. So he's working at this sociology institute. So he goes to the library and he says, look, I work at the Sociology Institute. We're doing a special project on the Jews. I really need to read the Bible. And the librarian tells him, well, no, you have to have special permission. You have to go get a permission from the director of your Sociology Institute. So he has to go to the director of the Sociology Institute and tell him, make a case and say, look, we constantly write about Jews and whatever, I'm sure I'm misquoting, misrepresenting, but he has to make a case why he should read the Bible. And so he gets this written permission, he goes, gets the Bible, essentially reads it in one night, it changes his perspective, and I've heard this over and over again. There was this desire to know, what is it in now, something bigger, right? Something bigger. What is there above? And some group of Jews, having kind of enriched their own understanding of themselves, also begin to teach others. And so a whole group of people emerges underground who are teaching Hebrew, who are showing like slideshows made from postcards from Tel Aviv, who are teaching Jewish history. And these are people also who decide that they want to go to Israel, they want to leave, they want to make Aliyah because they realize that Russia is not their country, Ukraine is not their country, the Soviet Union is not their state. And they explicitly, most of them, they don't fight the Soviet Union. In fact, some of them would say, look, I wish the Soviet people 500 years of Soviet power, go for it. But I, as a Jew, belong in Israel. And so this is how it begins. And then they refuse the right to emigrate. And while they're waiting, while they're in refusal, and to be refused was a very, very dangerous thing, a negative thing, because you would be fired from your job, you would be kicked out of school, you basically have nothing to do. But these people, you're pushed to the margins of society, that's what it is. But these people create this really enriching life for themselves and for those around them, and they begin to teach, they begin to spread samizdat. They retype by hand Uris's Exodus. It becomes like the best, hugely popular, very influential for Soviet Jews. So these are people, I think that there is something to bring your bring it back to something that we started with. Why the reason I think this is important to know today in this current American Jewish moment is that we are also in America facing issues of Jewish identity. And we're facing questions of, look, the Refuseniks are doing all of this against a massive, massive wave of anti-Israel propaganda and anti-Zionist propaganda, which they don't buy into, right? They just go completely against it. So how do we in America, what can we learn from them in terms of standing up for your Jewish identity, recovering it, reconnecting to the roots of your Jewish identity? Because look, if these assimilated Soviet Jews could do that, then we in America should be able to do that as well. And I think that Refuseniks provide kind of much needed heroes and role models that we're lacking today.
That is so beautifully said, Izabella, because I don't think that kids today really understand the role that Refuseniks played and just the strength and the power that these Refuseniks had. And I want to go there right now. And then I want to talk in broad brushstrokes really about Zionism and what you're doing with Jewish National Fund and just your definition of Zionism, because you are moderating a panel on Zionism and the legacy of Soviet Jewry in JNF's conversations on Zionism, reclaiming the narrative. What is your overarching message then about the legacy of Soviet Jewry and also about Refuseniks?
Look, I happen to think that Russian-speaking American Jews today actually have a special role and a special mission. And I've begun to articulate it in some of my articles. I articulated a lot more clearly, actually, in this upcoming piece that I already mentioned in Sapir. Look, I think because we have had this experience, we understand certain things that for American Jews are not so obvious. So one, of course, we already mentioned, these anti-Zionist slogans. You can't come to us and tell us that they are not anti-Semitic because we know that they are. We know their effect. We know what happens when a society assumes a politically weaponized anti-Zionist posture. We know that it's inevitable that Jewish lives will become worse. You can't come to us and tell us that there is no left anti-Semitism, for example, or say that the far-right anti-Semitism is much more dangerous than the far-left anti-Semitism. We see it holistically because guess what? Look, in my own history, I have a great-grandmother who was murdered at Babi Yar by Hitler's troops, and I have a great-grandfather who was murdered by Stalin, and I don't even know where he's buried, in some mass grave in Siberia. And it's typical. I mean, just about every Soviet Jewish family will have that history. So we know, both the far right and the far left anti-Semitism are dangerous. And so this division into two is just, it makes no sense. It only divides us. I think Natan Sharansky talks about it all the time, how this division, left and right anti-Semitism, instead of allowing them to divide ourselves, we need to unite and fight against both of them. And I think that the meaning of Israel also is much more clear for Russian-speaking Jews. So American RSJs, as they're called, Russian-speaking Jews, I think have a great opportunity to make a contribution. And I think that there is to the bigger American Jewish community. And I think actually there is a beautiful symmetry in this because many decades ago, years and decades ago, American Jews helped us. And we can now return the favor by sharing our wisdom and our collective memory, because for whatever reason, American Jews who participated so overwhelmingly in the struggle for Soviet Jewry have failed to transmit it to the next generation. And that gap in memory is unfortunately, I think, part of the reason why we are where we are today. And we don't have this gap of memory because it directly affected us and we can't afford to forget it. It's our family's histories. And I think that we need to be much more forward with sharing this experience, this lived experience.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up because Soviet Jews fought for their freedom to be Jews. They are incredible Zionists. And we need to teach that to the next generation today, why Israel is so important and why we need a strong Israel. And this is not lost on Jews that came from the Soviet Union who understand the need for a strong Israel and to be Zionists. And that's really what you're saying, aren't you?
Exactly. Absolutely. And look, there's a number of reasons why Russian-speaking Jews feel so connected to Israel. One is simply that 1 million of our closest family and friends moved to Israel when the Soviet Union fell apart. And so for us, even for those of us who moved to America, like my family did, we have that connection. It's very real for us. Mm-hmm. You can't sort of confuse us with propaganda about how Israel is apartheid or whatever, because we have been here. I'm in Israel now, so we have been here. It's very real to us. We know that the propaganda has nothing to do with reality and vice versa. So that's number one. And number two is it's very clear to us what happens when Israel is not there. We understand that Israel is an important, huge part of our strength as a people. And so somehow giving it up, or God forbid, divorcing, like sometimes you get these op-eds where they say, well, American Jews and Israeli Jews should just divorce. We're so different. And I just want to tear my hair out because that's another thing that Soviet propaganda really pushed, the idea that Jews are not a people. There is no such thing as a Jewish people. There are American Jews, there are Israeli Jews, and Soviet Jews have nothing to do with either one of those. Of course, they did it in a self-serving way because they didn't want Soviet Jews to want to emigrate, and they wanted to discredit the campaign for Soviet Jewry because they wanted to say, well, you say that Soviet Jews belong with you, but they don't. They're separate. They belong with the Soviet people. So it's like when I see this repeated today by American Jews, I'm like, well, come on, don't say that, you know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, Izabella. I mean, really, if you can do a little bit more of a deep dive, how contemporary Russian politics play into anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that whole dynamic, because we're not talking about 67 anymore, are we?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And this is something actually that intrigues me as a researcher. And I think it's crying out for someone to come and do a more serious investigation of how this rhetoric got revived, basically wholesale from those years. The role of the Russian state today is complex. I mean, look, for one thing, it doesn't anymore advocate political anti-Zionism the way it used to. That ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russia today is not anti-Zionist in any kind of way, shape, or form. There may be individual actors who will advocate these ideas, but it doesn't come from the top anymore. Putin is Russia has a good diplomatic relationship with Israel. It's not out of particular, people say that Putin loves Jews, or at least he doesn't hate Jews. I don't think it matters. I mean, the diplomatic relationship, as any diplomatic relationship, is based on a set of interests, mutual interests. There is some realpolitik there. So it's there. But what you do also have is that, for example, Russia, it is known that Russia supports certain far-right groups in Europe, for example, and that's been proven. I suspect that it also probably supports some far-left groups. That hasn't been proven, but I think only because nobody has looked into it. It's usually people are much more interested in the far right. But if you look at the Russian television, for example, Russian federal channels, they host some of the sort of biggest far-left anti-Zionists that the West knows, like George Galloway from the UK. You have Max Blumenthal appearing for interviews. I think Galloway hosted a show, I'm pretty sure, is either on one of the federal channels on Russia Today. So there is, I think, look, Russia always kind of plays multiple cards. It always plays multiple hands. One of its objectives is to be creating chaos and creating internal divisions and play on the internal divisions. And it knows very, very well how to push Jewish issues, what buttons to push with Jewish issues. It knows how divisive they can be because it manipulated these issues throughout the Cold War. And so it plays on a number of planes in this regard. It's just different from the way it used to be in Soviet times.
I see. And then I'm just wondering, let's go back to you and your background before we move on to other points of Zionism, because as you said, you were raised in Novosibirsk. I'm just wondering, Izabella, when did you actually leave, and what was the run-up like for you when you were about ready to leave? And also, what was it like even for you when wheels up on the plane?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So we left in 1989 in October. It was October 25th of 89. And it was 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall came down. And what's interesting about it is that even as we were leaving, we had no inkling that the Soviet Union might fall apart within basically 2 years, that the wall might come down. Nobody could imagine. As we were leaving, the Soviet Union felt like it stands as strong as it always did, and it will stand forever. And I think that most people probably throughout Perestroika felt this way because it was just somehow that way. In retrospect, when it did fall apart, many people looked back and said, "Oh, of course, it makes complete sense." Suddenly they could connect the dots. Suddenly it all fell into place. But in reality, nobody could have foreseen it from inside, especially because even during Perestroika, even as the media landscape began to open up, you still didn't get full information. And so it was only later that I learned that throughout the summer of 89 and the run up to our departure, as we were preparing all of the documents for our departure, there was this whole thing going on in Eastern Europe. East Germans were leaving, fleeing East Germany, breaching the border with Hungary. It was clear that some movement, something was happening. We got none of that information. And so when we got to Austria, which was our transit point, and on November 9th, I heard on BBC, I was the only person who spoke English in our family. I heard on the BBC that the Berlin Wall came down. I just thought that I misunderstood. I was like, there's something wrong with my English. Clearly, it's my first time abroad using English. I don't know. I probably misunderstood something. It was just really shocking and hard to understand and hard to imagine. But yeah, I mean, the thing about leaving from the Soviet Union is we have to understand you were still leaving from behind the Iron Curtain. And so they were still telling you that you will never be able to come back. It's a decision that you make forever, for the rest of your life. You will never see your relatives again. I mean, imagine if you wanted to make Aliyah from America and you were told, this is a final decision. You can never go back to America. You can never see your relatives again. And these are times when, obviously, before the internet, before Zoom, before even cell phones, when even an international call costs a fortune, right? So I still remember sort of the wail of my relatives and my family as we were leaving, as we were crossing the passport control finally, because we thought we would never see each other again. They treated us horribly. Again, this was very typical. They opened up all of the suitcases, just taking out everything that they thought somehow, we didn't bring anything that wasn't permitted, but they just hung on to everything, took a bunch of jewelry that had no value except sentimental value, just to humiliate people. And so when we crossed that passport control, that border, and got on the plane, I remember this thought clearly, like, this is, it's over. Like that, those bridges are burned. Now I can only look forward. And I think for about 10 or 15 years of my life in America, that's really all I did. I only look forward. I never really thought about my background, about what it meant to be a Soviet Jew, because it's like, it was all gone. It was all psychologically, it was all kind of left behind.
And how interesting that you left on October 25th, because we should share with our listeners, we're recording this on October 24th, the day before your anniversary. So what goes through your mind every October 25th? What's going to go through your mind tomorrow, Izabella?
Well, we do actually sometimes, I might call my parents and we might talk about it and think back on that departure. I think that for us, we more often think about the day of our arrival in America, which was February 28th of 1990. So that's what we celebrate a lot of times. It's kind of the beginning of our new life.
You touched on something that I want to build on, and that's this notion of the future, because I think Jewish people as a whole are very optimistic. I mean, the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva, hope. I think we Americans are very optimistic. It's always that city on the shining hill that we're trying to build and that we're trying to get to. Manifest destiny, the best is yet to come. What was the future looking like for the average Soviet person, let's say in the 60s and 70s? What did they think that the future held for them?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I probably would feel more comfortable talking about the 80s because I came of age during Perestroika. And so, look, I think that by that time, of course, let me go back to the 70s also and say that I think by the 70s, the party was still holding on to the idea that we were on our path to building communism, because they realized at some point long before that communism was not arriving as fast as they expected. And so they did a flip and they said that, okay, well, first we're going to build socialism and now we're going to arrive to communism at some time in the 80s. And it was pretty clear by late 70s, I think, that we weren't getting to communism. And I think then the perestroika came. And the thing about it was that perestroika, on the one hand, created a lot of optimism. And it was an incredibly cathartic time because it was a time when suddenly, this is when I think Soviet experience is also important for a contemporary moment, is that all of a sudden, the truth began to come out. I think today we have an issue with the truth. I think today people are a lot of times afraid to or insist that people don't speak the truth because if it diverges from a certain ideological perspective. We have an experience of living in a society that insisted on a certain ideological perspective, and therefore lots of books could not be published, lots of things could not be said in the open. And perestroika is when all of that breaks. And suddenly all these books, especially books, I remember, I think it's for everyone, for me certainly, the books about Stalin's repressions begin to come out. And it's an incredibly riveting moment when suddenly you realize, okay, here is the truth. Like, I knew that something was wrong. I knew that something was off, or something was missing. And how is it that I didn't know this? And suddenly you have the truth. And it's just incredibly, incredibly powerful. And you have a lot of music, underground bands coming up, and they are kind of reflecting on the current moment, again, in a way in which the artists could not do before. And on the other hand, it is also a moment when you really don't understand what's going to happen, because suddenly there's crime that takes over a lot of whole big sections of the economy. And I can tell you a story of my own, because I was entering, this is actually relevant to the Soviet Jewish experience. I was applying to college in 1987. And I wanted to study in Moscow. And first of all, they told me right away, well, look, you want to go here and here and here, don't even bother because they don't accept Jews for this at this department. So I said, okay, well, I'll choose this college. And I apply and I pass entrance exams. You do in-person entrance exams in Russia at the time, and in the Soviet Union at the time. And I passed them with flying colors, right? Like, I see the list, I'm in the top 5 in terms of how I passed. And they refused me. They refused to admit me. And my dad goes to try to figure out what is happening. Why are you not admitting her? And they give him all these baloney excuses, which is obvious. Because they say, well, you are from the provinces and we only accept Muscovites, those who have Moscow residency. And of course, we know that it's baloney, because otherwise, why would they even accept me to take exams? Anyway, so my dad has to go, and I'm crushed. I'm completely crushed because I really, really wanted to study in Moscow. And the thing is, it's like a 17-year-old whose dream is taken away through no fault of their own. There's like this profound injustice because I studied really hard. I did everything I could. Look, I saw the lists. I was in the top 5. Why are they taking this away from me? So my dad realizes that he has to restore his child's sense of justice. So he starts going to all of these party organs, going from one to the next, to the highest and highest. I think at some point he gets to the central committee, and they can't help him and they don't want to help him. Eventually he realizes that because this is perestroika and the press is becoming more influential, he actually goes to a journalist who he knows writes about higher education very critically. And he tells her, look, this is what happened to my daughter. And she says to him, I completely believe you, and I will write about your case. But let's try something simpler first. You go back to them and you tell them that if they don't accept your girl, I will write about you and about them. They will be hearing from me. So my dad does that, and they accept me immediately, which just kind of proves that they knew that they were
in the wrong, as we say.
They were in the wrong. But the thing that this did for me is that on the one hand, this was victory. And on the other hand, it was a kind of victory that makes you feel like, wow, if this is what it takes to get what's mine, really, right? What I really worked hard for, what future do I have in this country? Like, there will be a time when my dad will not be able to stand up for me. What will I do then? And I knew that I didn't have the personality to do what he did. I mean, I'm just in awe of what he did. And so I think I felt all along that there would be no future for me. And I think that for a lot of Soviet Jews, this was really the main thing that drove them out of the country. They recognized that for their children, there will never be a future in that country. And that's what made them make that very difficult decision. It's a difficult decision to decide that I'm going to leave what I know forever. I can't go back ever. I'll never see the rest of my family ever. I'm leaving. But that's because they felt that there was no future.
Izabella, I'm just really curious if we can just shift gears for a little bit right now. President Ronald Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz, how did Soviet Jews view them?
It's a really interesting question. I can't tell you much about Schultz, but Reagan, I mean, this is interesting. I've had interesting experiences with that. Because, when I came to the US, I became a Democratic voter. I voted Democrat for decades. But when my American friends early on would kind of make fun of Reagan to me, and they would say, oh, Reagan, and his ridiculous speech about the Soviet Union as an evil empire. I think that they thought that because I think that they were trying to ingratiate themselves with me. They would think that, well, she's Russian, she's from the Soviet Union. Of course, she would feel resentful of Reagan saying that. And that was such a strange experience for me, because I would say, but it was it was an evil empire. I mean, do you guys not get it? I think for us, as we looked at Reagan when he came in and he really took on the Soviet leaders, look, we knew nothing about American domestic politics, but what we saw was, first of all, he made an impression compared to all of our geriatric leaders. If you remember in the 80s, we had kind of a procession of these really walking corpses. And suddenly comes Reagan, good looking, kind of with a sense of humor, charming. And I think we were just all kind of fascinated. And he begins basically to speak the truth. He's not trying to curry favor with Gorbachev or anybody. We all loved the fact that he had this shtick. It was a shtick of memorizing Soviet jokes and telling them and quoting them back to the Soviet leaders. And a lot of times there were these funny sayings that kind of poked fun at the system. And I think that for us, we understood that he was kind of like winking at us. It was a wink at the ordinary people who were sick and tired of the system, which used them and where they had no recourse to anything. I think he really made quite an impression. I think that a lot of Soviet Jews remember him very fondly.
You know what I love is when he used to say, trust but verify.
Right.
Can you say it in Russian?
Доверяй, но проверяй.
Right. I use that all the time, even now, I always
really?
tell people, absolutely, whenever anyone needs to do anything for me, or I need to do something for somebody else, I always say, as Reagan said to Gorbachev, trust but verify, right? Because you have to trust, but you have to really verify, don't you?
That's correct. Exactly.
Right. Indeed. Let's just switch gears then and talk really about Zionism right now, because as you know, Jewish National Fund USA has launched a year-long campaign called Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. Those just brilliant conversations can be found at youtube.com/Zionism Studios. Once again, for all of our dear listeners around the world who are listening, youtube.com/Zionism Studios. And with that in mind, Izabella, I'd really love to hear your definition of Zionism and what Zionism means to you.
Well, look, my definition, I think, is fairly standard. It's a liberation movement of the Jewish people. That's really how I view it. Today, I think when I say that I'm a Zionist, it's funny because in Israel, you don't really need to be saying it. In Israel, they live it. So it's a little bit different. But outside of Israel, look, to me, it simply means that I support the right of the state of Israel to exist. It's as simple as that, because that's what anti-Zionism has become. And so it feels like by asserting my Zionism, I'm saying that I believe in this national home for the Jewish people.
How do you think Zionism, or how do you think anti-Zionism should be countered?
Wow, that's a really good question. It's a hard question, obviously, because we haven't really been successful at it. I mean, the question is, are we talking about countering it on the propaganda level, on the level of ideas, or are we talking about it sort of on the level of simply living for Israel to be living and getting stronger and better and more beautiful and prosperous, etc. The difficulty with fighting anti-Zionism, and I make this point sometimes, is that it is propaganda. It's very hard. You can't defeat it through logic. Right. And I think a lot of times we do it, and it's not a mistake. I mean, we have to keep speaking the truth and addressing some of these points, point by point. But in the end, what is propaganda versus a regular kind of factual statement? Propaganda is constructed to hit you first on the emotional level, on the gut level, and which is why a lot of, for example, Soviet propaganda was very inaccurate, factually inaccurate with regards to Israel and Zionism, because they didn't care. They knew that they had to give you a punch in the gut. And by the time the fact-checking crew arrives, it already doesn't matter, because no facts can ever compare to a gut punch or to emotional impact. And this is what happens with these statements. Zionism is racism, Zionism is apartheid, or the statement that Al-Aqsa is in danger, right? The idea is to deliver an emotional punch. And that's what makes it difficult, because we don't work that way. You can't. First of all, we don't have resources to do that. This propaganda was created by real pros who had all the budget in the world. There's no way that we could ever match that on the propagandistic level, nor do we want to, I think. I think that what we need to do is to work on ourselves, so to speak, as a people, as a Jewish people. I think that we need to strengthen our identity. I think that we need to get a sense of peoplehood. That's another thing that I think Soviet Jews understand that we are together, even though we live on different continents, we are a people. We need to strengthen our own knowledge base to kind of inculcate or to immunize ourselves against propaganda. And I think that, and just focus on what's important for us as a people. Now, I know that obviously we can never agree on anything, but I think that there is some foundational basis that we can and should agree on. And I think if we do that, like these things that I mentioned, then we ourselves will be far more, we'll be anti-fragile, we'll be much stronger, we'll be able to resist the propaganda ourselves. That's our first task, I think.
Izabella, before we get on to the work that you're doing right now and why you're in Jerusalem, just want to go back to Reagan for a second. You talked about the fact that the Soviet people liked the fact that he was an energetic, charismatic individual. What was the response when he made that speech at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall?
I can't tell you, I can't give you everybody's kind of response, because that I don't remember, but I remember being incredibly moved myself by that phrase. It just felt, it's just like, just like reading all those books that had been prohibited, or just like hearing the songs that appeared from underground during perestroika. It's like, I think I wrote it somewhere that truth was our drug and we were getting high on it. And this was another line that was so true. It's like, yes, let's tear down this wall because it needs to go. So for me, the impact was very, very strong.
And I'm guessing that you've been back.
I have been back, yes, many times, yes.
And what was that like the first time, and when was that, Izabella?
The first time was, I think, in the 90s. I went for work. Maybe it was, I think it was in the 90s. So, I know I said earlier that I hadn't thought about kind of my background or my past for a very long time. And I mean that sort of in a personal way, in terms of what it meant to be growing up in the Soviet Union. But I did go back, I think about 10 years later, for work. And it was, of course, a very different Russia, because this was already several years after the Soviet Union fell apart. It was already a capitalist country. I think what really, these radical changes, from a country that had been gray with long lines for, your basic food items with no advertisement. All of a sudden you were in Moscow, which was just bursting with new restaurants, new stores, really super expensive stores from the West basically in the Red Square, where essentially they established themselves in a building in the Red Square, which would have been just unimaginable. And, it gave me a mixed feeling. It gave me a mixed feeling in a way, because in a way it was like, okay, wow, Russia is catching up with the world. And on the other hand, what became really obvious was this just massive discrepancy, in wealth, that all of a sudden for Russia to have these super expensive designer stores. And then right next door, there were these poor ladies. I was staying actually at a really good hotel because it was for work. And I was just mortified to see this old lady come in to clean my room, because I was not used to it. I had never, it's like it was somebody's grandmother, who was now coming to clean the rooms of rich foreigners, essentially. That's who stayed in those rooms. So it was very difficult for me to stomach. It's very interesting. It's very, it was just that big contrast that created very complex feelings for me.
I think I told you in our first conversation, my parents were first there in November of 1973. It was a month after the Yom Kippur War, and my late father was a physician, and so they went with a medical group to Moscow and then what was called Leningrad, of course, today St. Petersburg. And I remember them sharing with me the stories of just really how grim it was, not only because it was winter, but also just because of the society and just how difficult a time it was for them. Fast forward to 2014, and I paid my first visit to Moscow, and now called St. Petersburg. And I thought, this is not my parents' Russia. I mean, my eyes just popped out of my head. And I also did very much notice the contrast between the haves and the have-nots. And, while every society has it, but for me, there was particularly an unseemliness about it. And just the extravagance of the nouveau riche was taken to a level that I've been all over the world, that I don't know if I've really seen anywhere else. And it was a bit troubling.
Well, that's exactly right. You used the right word, the nouveau riche, and when you, especially when you were used to seeing an egalitarian society where everybody's equally poor, right, where everybody's equally destitute, to then see some become so wildly rich while others have remained at the same level or even worse, it's very, very troubling. It's very troubling.
Right.
And at the same time, look, I mean, it was obvious that creativity got unleashed. The new newspapers were not your old Soviet newspapers. I remember being completely riveted by these new newspapers that spoke in real live Russian, as opposed to these Sovietese, very bureaucratic, very hard to read and understand language that did not report anything real. So it's very, very mixed, very mixed.
Well, I should say, on a lighter note, though, from a touristic standpoint, I was there in the dead of winter. I was there in late December, early January. And Izabella, it was magic. I mean, first of all, to see Red Square snowed in, to see St. Petersburg and the river all snowed up. There were no lines anywhere. I mean, I remember being at the Hermitage. I made several visits there. And in the room where there are the canvases of Matisse's dancers and musicians, these enormous canvases, I was the only one in the room for a good 10 minutes or so. I remember going to see Lenin's tomb, and I went twice. The first day, I think I was the third person in line. And then the second time I was the first, whereas if you go during the height of tourist season, the line is up the wazoo. So there is something to be said for going in the dead of winter. I just thought it was magical. I'm a big art lover and I love history. So Russia is really the place for both. You can tick off both boxes on that score. It is actually a wonderful touristic destination.
Yeah. I'm fascinated that you went to see the Lenin's tomb twice, because I actually have never been. I refused to go on principle. What was it like for you? And why did you go twice, if I may ask?
Because I'm one of those people that I can't absorb anything the first time. And if possible, I need to go the second time. And also when you walk in, there is the wall that borders the Kremlin, and many well-known Russians like Yuri Gagarin are buried there, Andropov, and some of the other figures in Russian history are all buried there. And I wanted to go back and see who was buried there and to be able to point them out for myself. I taught myself enough Cyrillic. I'm not a Russian speaker, but I could read enough that I could make out everybody's name. I was able to go through the whole subway system just by making out the letters. In fact, listen, I'm not one to pat myself on the back, but I landed in Moscow and I went myself via train from the airport to one of the subway stations, and then I made it and transferred all the way to the subway stop next to the Metropole Hotel where I stayed. And I was able to do that all by myself. And I felt very proud of myself, Izabella. But the point is that I wanted to go see all of those figures that were buried there. And then I just wanted to see Lenin there as well. I told you I was a trained China specialist. And so I had gone to see Chairman Mao several times, working for a short time in Vietnam. I wanted to go see Ho Chi Minh. So I've seen all of these people embalmed, and I wanted to see what kind of job they did with Lenin. So there you go. Well, listen, if it's any comfort, I should say I've lived in New York now since 2006, and I'm super embarrassed to tell you that I have never been to the Statue of Liberty. I have seen it. And now I'm not allowed, listen, I'm not comparing Lenin to the Statue of Liberty, but I'm just saying from a point of interest standpoint, yes. I haven't been there either. And I've never been to Vegas or Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon. So
that's what happens to us. That's what happens.
But I'm just wondering why have you not been? And would you ever consider even going, or is it just more of a moral issue that you would not want to go see him?
You know, I don't know if it's a moral issue. I think that when I lived there, and I studied in Moscow for 2 years, so I could have gone, but I don't know. I think that maybe it was some kind of an inner sense of protest that I didn't want to honor him with my presence and my attention. And today, I don't feel like I want to look at a corpse, basically. The whole idea feels really absurd and ridiculous to me. And I know that there's been conversation about burying him finally, like letting the poor old body rest. And I don't know if it will ever happen. But yeah, at this point, I just feel a bit of this, like I just don't want to do that, you know.
Do you know what's interesting, Izabella, is that it's interesting how people approach those types of experiences, because on the one hand, I totally get it. On the other hand, it's almost as if you say to him, I am here and the Jewish people are here and you are not, and your whole system isn't, and we won.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
Right. So it's something to think about. Listen, as we wind down our conversation, first of all, we have to have you back, because I want to hear just more about the work that you're doing, and also really to share more stories of what it was like living as a Jew in the Soviet Union. But I want to know now, in terms of fast forward to today, what are you doing in Jerusalem? Talk a little bit about your work and what you're hoping to get out of your experience there right now.
Sure. So I've been here for a few months, I think about a year almost. And I'm researching, I'm doing some research that's sort of an outgrowth of some of my articles on Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. And I want to really dig into that Soviet propagandistic output, the anti-Zionist, anti-Israel literature that they put out, because they put out a lot of it. They created a whole vast structure of it. They tried to make it look scientific. You know, it was whole entire institutes involved in it. The Academy of Sciences was involved in it. So essentially, you know, I sit in the library and I read all of that stuff, which is, you know, on the one hand, as a researcher, I'm in heaven, because the library here in Jerusalem has all of it. Which
library are we talking about?
The National Library, the National Library of Israel. They have everything, and they're incredibly quick. You order a book online, and within like 20 minutes, they're already holding it for you. It's amazing. I just compare it to the Library of Congress, which of course is a wonderful institution, but it's much more complicated and so huge. And they don't have the kind of stuff that they have here. Understandably, why would they collect it? So that's what I'm doing, and perhaps at some point it will be a book. I don't know, but I'm trying to make more sense of how this whole propaganda came into life.
Fascinating. We look forward to hearing more. But in the meantime, Izabella, this has just been such a wonderful and enlightening conversation, and we just want to thank you so much for joining us here on IsraelCast. I think this is going to be the first of several times that you'll be on the program. If you agree to come back, we'd love to have you.
I would love to come. Really enjoyed talking to you. So it's definitely to be continued. Thank you for having me.
All right. And we'll have info about Izabella on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And before we move on to housekeeping, I'd like to remind you that Jewish National Fund USA believes the time has come for us to reclaim the narrative, take ownership of the word Zionism. So we've been talking about, and to show the world how beautiful, inclusive, and inspirational Zionism really is. So do join Jewish National Fund USA's Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. As we said, it's a year-long series which will educate, engage, and inspire on the true meaning of the word Zionism, and as we've said, reclaim its true meaning in all its glory. Check out all the conversations at youtube.com/Zionism Studios. There's a whole lot in there. You will definitely appreciate all of the videos at youtube.com/Zionism Studios. Now, of course, we do release new episodes of IsraelCast every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. It's so easy. Just search for IsraelCast. And don't forget to rate and review us to make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. You can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. I hope you know it by now. It's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. And for that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, and Olivia Schendel. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. Now, IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more information about JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, we would all love to hear from you. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.